script. Or I think I actually have to do that. Yep. Okay. All right. I think we are recording and we can start the meeting.
Okay. Thanks, Andrea. Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this virtual BCDC Design Review Board meeting. My name is Jacinta McCann, and I'm the chair of the BCDC's Design Review Board. Our first order of business is to call the roll. Board members, please unmute yourselves to respond and then mute yourselves again after responding. Andrea, can you call the roll, please?
Yeah, happy to. Start with Chair McCann.
Present.
Vice Chair Strang.
Present.
Board members Battaglio.
Present.
Kristen Hall.
Present.
Tom Leader.
Present.
Stefan Pellegrini.
Present.
We know he's here. Yeah, thank you. And Andrew Wolfram.
Present.
Great. Everybody's here.
Well, thank you, Andrea. We have a quorum present, and thank you for those of you who are traveling and joining us for to accomplish the quorum. So we're duly constituted to conduct business, and I'd like to share some instructions with you on how we can best participate in this meeting so that it runs as smoothly as possible. Please make sure that you have your microphones or phones muted to avoid background noise. For board members, if you have a webcam, please make sure that it is on so everyone can see you. For members of the public, if you would like to speak during a public comment period that is part of the agenda item, you will need to do so in one of two ways. First, if you are attending on the Zoom platform, please raise your virtual hand on Zoom, in Zoom. If you are new to Zoom and you joined our meeting using the Zoom application, click the hand at the bottom of your screen and the hand should turn blue when it's raised. The second way, if you're joining our meeting via phone, you must press *9 on your keypad to raise or lower your hand to make a comment, and *6 to mute or unmute your phone. We will call on individuals who have raised their hands in the order that they are raised during the public comment period for each project. After you are called on, you will be unmuted so that you can share your comments. Please state your name and affiliation at the beginning of your remarks. Remember, you have a limit of 3 minutes to speak on an item, and we will tell you when you have 1 minute remaining. Please keep your comments respectful and focused. We are here to listen to everyone who wishes to address us, but everyone has the responsibility to act in a civil manner. We will not tolerate hate speech, threats made directly or indirectly, and/or abusive language. We will mute anyone who fails to follow these guidelines or who exceeds the established time limits without permission. For public comments, please note that we will only hear your voices. Your video will not be enabled. If you would like to add your contact information to the interested parties list to be notified at future meetings concerning these projects, please call or email the Board Secretary, Andrea Gaffney, whose contact information is on the screen or is found on the BCDC's website. Finally, every now and then you will hear me refer to the meeting host, Ashley. Our BCDC staff are acting as hosts for the meeting behind the scenes to ensure that the technology moves the meeting forward smoothly and consistently. Please be patient with us if it's needed. And now the Board Secretary will provide a staff update.
Okay, thanks, Chair McCann. See if I can get this slide to advance. There we go. Okay, so this brief update. Staff recently had the opportunity to visit the waterfront in Benicia. This image shows a section of the waterfront that was developed about 15 years ago. It's interesting to think how the shoreline would be designed today, given our current understanding of sea level rise. So just wanted to share an image of the bay of a location that we probably don't get to go to very often. The August meeting minutes will hopefully be ready for the October Design Review Board meeting. They're not ready yet. The next DRB meeting will be October 17th and will include project reviews for the Middle Harbor Shoreline Park 7th Street connector, which is the connector bikeway enhancements in Oakland. And then a first review of the 10 Twin Dolphin Drive redevelopment project in Redwood Shores. There will also be a conflict of interest briefing by the staff attorney, Michael Ng. And the last thing I wanted to send an update on is to recognize that this is Andrew Wolfram's last meeting as a board member. He's going to become an alternate after this as he embarks on his journey to Italy. So that concludes the staff update, and happy to answer any questions.
Does anyone have any questions? Andrew?
I just want to say how much I've appreciated working with all of you over the last 2 years and being on this design review board. It's been a real honor to see these fantastic projects, to work with the amazing BCDC staff, but also to incredible intelligence and talents that all of the design board members bring. It's really been a great honor. So I want to just thank you all for that. And we will be seeing each other again, since I will be an alternate in the future.
Well, Andrew, thanks so much for those comments. And I would like to respond on behalf of the DRB as well, and just say how much we valued your contributions during the last 2 years. If I think back on the projects that you've reviewed, I can say with certainty that the perspective you bring from your professional background and knowledge has really made a difference in a substantial way. So we'll miss you. We'll look forward to seeing you as an alternate when you come back from Italy, or perhaps even while you're in Italy. But wishing you the very best for your trip to Italy, to Europe, and this next phase.
Thank you.
Okay, so with that, we will move on to the third review of the Middle Harbour Shoreline Park in Oakland, Alameda County. To remind you of the review order, the project review order, we'll start with the staff introduction, then we'll move to the project proponent presentation, followed by the board clarifying questions, followed by public comment, then board discussion and summary, and then a project proponent response, a brief response at the end of that. And so with that, I'll ask Catherine Pan to introduce the project. Catherine is the BCDC permanent analyst. Over to you, Catherine.
Thank you. All right, let me share my screen. Okay, everything looking right?
Looking good.
Okay, let me move this far out of the way. Okay, great. So thank you, Chair McCann, and good evening, board members. I'm Catherine Pan, the Principal Shoreline Development Analyst at BCDC. And before I present the staff introduction, I'd like to remind the project team and staff to please turn on your video when you're speaking or answering questions. When you're not actively engaged with the board, please turn off your video and mute your microphones so that we can minimize distractions on the screen. And now I'm happy to introduce the project for tonight's review. This is the third review of the Middle Harbour Shoreline Park Master Plan and the Management Plan Update proposed by the Port of Oakland. The first DRB review of this project was in July of 2021, and the second was in March of 2022. I'll start with a brief introduction to the project before the applicants present the project in greater detail. And since not all the board members may have been present for both of the previous reviews, I'll start the introduction with similar information to the previous presentations. To orient you, the project site is located in a highly industrialized area at the Port of Oakland. It's about 46 acres in size, including the approximately 40-acre Middle Harbour Shoreline Park and the approximately 6-acre Portview Park. And before I continue, I'd like to acknowledge that the majority of the land at the site was once underwater, located on or near Huichin, the unceded ancestral homeland of the Muwekma Ohlone people. We offer gratitude to the indigenous peoples who were the original stewards of the bountiful natural resources of the Bay Area. Now this slide, borrowed from the Port's July 21st presentation, shows the current layout of the project site. The current Middle Harbor Shoreline Park Master Plan, which is being updated, covers the 36-acre Middle Harbor Shoreline Park and the 2-acre Portview Park connection, shown here. The 6-acre Portview Park, located to the west, is not a part of the current master plan. However, the port has proposed new improvements to this park to complement those at Middle Harbor Shoreline Park. As you can see, the parks are entirely enclosed by port facilities along their inland borders, and along their bayward edges, the parks encircle the Middle Harbor Shoreline or Middle Harbor Enhancement Area, an approximately 189-acre shallow subtidal habitat restoration area that provides valuable wildlife habitat and viewing opportunities for park visitors. And then to the south is the mouth of the Oakland Alameda Estuary. Outside of the parks, the port is considering bicycle and pedestrian enhancements to the 7th Street corridor, which they plan to present at the October DRB meeting. And here's a bit of the site's recent history to help you understand the project context. During the Spanish colonization period, the site was part of El Rancho de San Antonio, a large Spanish land grant to Don Luis Maria Peralta. And in 1874, a deep water port was created at the site. And during World War II, the portion of the site that would become Middle Harbor Shoreline Park came under the control of the US Navy as part of its 150-acre Fleet Industrial Supply Center, Oakland, otherwise known as FISCO. In 1998, the port acquired the FISCO area from the Navy and planned the Vision 2000 program to redevelop the area and modernize and expand the port's maritime facilities. Portview Park, shown here, was constructed by the port in 1971 outside the bounds of the FISCO area in conjunction with the Port 7th Street Terminal Complex. The park closed following damage from the Loma Prieta earthquake, but in 1995, the port reopened the park and expanded it from approximately 2.5 to 6 acres, pursuant to the requirements of BCDC Permit 1999-012, which authorized a container terminal project at Berth 30. This slide shows a recent satellite image of the site, illustrating a significant reconfiguration of the shoreline. Middle Harbor Shoreline Park was constructed in 2004 as part of the Vision 2000 program, which included deepening navigation channels and berths and building a new container terminal at berths 55 through 58. The park was partially constructed on new fill as the public access requirement of the port's maritime expansion project. Dredge sediments from the deepening project were also used in part to create the park's beach and the neighboring Middle Harbor Habitat Enhancement Area. As part of Vision 2000, the port conducted an extensive 2-year community engagement process in developing the initial park master plan. As shown in this image from BCDC's Community Vulnerability Mapping tool, the closest communities to the parks in West Oakland have higher levels of social vulnerability and contamination risk. These communities have historically been subject to significant health and environmental impacts from port activities, but the parks have become a valuable resource for these communities. And here's the original Vision 2000 Park Master Plan, which called for a variety of programs and uses for the park and the connector. And this image shows Middle Harbor Shoreline Park when it was first built in 2004. Note that north is this way. The image has been rotated 90 degrees to match the orientation of the figures you'll see in the port's presentation. But this park originally opened under a management agreement with the East Bay Regional Park District. At the time of opening, the beach area was a large portion of the promenade area. In 2006, an additional lawn and dunes were added to the beach area, as you can see here. And then in 2009, the port terminated the management contract with the East Bay Regional Parks District due to cost concerns. We'll touch on park management and maintenance issues in a moment, but these are driving some of the port's proposals for the master plan and the management plan updates. So I'll share a little more detail on some of the challenges that Middle Harbor Shoreline Park is facing to provide context for why the port is updating the master and management plans. These include maintenance, beach conditions, non-completion of required public access facilities, and special events procedures. One of the most significant issues has been inadequate maintenance. Port and BCDC staff have been working together for several years to address maintenance issues at Middle Harbor Shoreline Park, and the port has made some significant progress. The master plan update is a key component to resolving some of the larger remaining issues. The first major maintenance issue has to do with the lawns. So this image shows the lawns in the spring of 2020 when they were green due to the rains. But the grasses die back in the summer when park use is high. And this is due to inadequate irrigation as well as a sandy substrate at much of the site, which doesn't retain water very well. As a quick side note, the lawn at Portview Park, shown at the top center of the screen, does remain green during the summer. Notably, these parks are managed under different management schemes. And then this site photo shows an on-the-ground perspective of the center dieback of lawn cover. This is about what it looks like right now. We took a quick site visit there last week to take a look around. It's about in this condition. And in addition to the lawn, many of the other amenities at Middle Harbor Shoreline Park are in poor condition. Many of the trails are deteriorated, as shown in this image, although recently the port has added some new paving to certain trails. The port will be discussing maintenance and plantings as part of their presentation today after this introduction. These images show the observation tower on the UP Mole, which provides some sweeping panoramic views of the park, the port, the Oakland Estuary, and San Francisco. The elevator at the tower has been out of order for more than 15 years, making the upper level inaccessible to those who aren't able to climb the stairs. And then another issue with the current state of Middle Harbor Shoreline Park is that the beach doesn't provide a safe environment for swimming or wading due to the presence of deep soft mud at the site. The subtidal aspect of the beach is being addressed through a separate process by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the port as part of the Middle Harbor Enhancement Area project. And at the last DRB meeting, board members asked for additional technical information about the proposed beach design, which has been shared as part of the staff report sent on September 1st. And the port will be able to speak to the beach in more detail as part of its presentation. Furthermore, several of the originally envisioned amenities in the Middle Harbor Shoreline Park Master Plan were not built. And these include an interpretive center / educational building and expansion, a community conference center, research field station, boat docking facilities at the UP Mole Notch, which is shown on the left, and some other amenities. The port has proposed replacements for some of these, including the planned education buildings, but not all of them, in the master plan update. And many of these were covered at the March DRB review. Another concern that the port will discuss in some more detail today is that the park doesn't have a BCDC authorized process for handling larger special events or concerts. In the past, from approximately 2005 to 2019, the port held numerous large events at Middle Harbor Shoreline Park that resulted in significant or complete closures of the park to the public, although the port is not currently holding these large events at the park. Most of these events were music festivals for which people had to purchase tickets for entry, and most were not authorized by BCDC, which is a permit requirement given that these events were impacting public access. This image shows a large special event that occurred in 2018. And to give you some more context for the scope of the public events held at the park, staff has created a series of illustrations depicting the park's required public access and the areas of event closures for these past events. So to start, here's a map of the park and its picnic areas without any closures. In 2014, the park hosted an Aeolian Day public event, a one-day event which involved no closures of the public access area. And the event was located on the lawn in this orange area here and had an attendance of approximately 1,200 people. Then in 2018 and 2019, the park hosted two ticketed two-day music festivals. And for these, the event footprint was located on the lawn area and along Point Arnold, but the closure affected the entire park. These events hosted about 10 to 12,000 people per day and required 4 days for load in and load out. And then in 2018, the Treasure Island Music Festival closed both Middle Harbor Shoreline Park and Portview Park, and a traffic checkpoint prevented vehicles from approaching the area. And this was also a two-day event with 10 to 12,000 people per day. Between 2013 and 2018, the park hosted an annual event called All Day I Dream. This is a one-day event of about 2,500 to 4,000 people where the park was being closed and shoreline impacts were observed. For 2019, the most recent event, BCDC asked the port to reconfigure the event space to allow public access to the park. And the 2019 version of the annual event reflects the modified event footprint here. So for this event, they were able to keep the majority of the park open to the public We use this as a test case to see how the event impacted the park and the nearby habitat areas. And pulling the event away from the beach was an effective measure for habitat impacts, and keeping the remainder of the park open, including some parking, was a benefit to the public who wanted to use the park. And these images show some of the impacts on the park from large events, including cars parked on the lawn during events and damage to the park infrastructure after events. These impacts are not unusual with large events, but were not considered in the original master plan or in the design of the park. In 2019, BCDC enforcement staff and port staff began negotiations to resolve the challenges at Middle Harbor Shoreline Park, many of which represent violations to the BCDC permit. The port has made significant progress, but much work remains. Pursuant to BCDC and port negotiations in 2021, the port initiated a public process to update the park's master and management plans to resolve outstanding issues at the park and redesign portions of the park to modernize it, to better meet the needs of users and reduce maintenance needs. After 15 years of use, it's typical for a park to revisit its design and layout and to adjust its plans and programs. And finally, I'd like to briefly touch on the current status of Portview Park. The park was largely built to the requirements of the permit and includes a range of required public access amenities, including benches, fishing pier, historic railroad building with a second floor observation area, play area, public parking, restroom, and related amenities. And similar to Middle Harbor Shoreline Park, there are several permit compliance issues at the site, including missing required public access amenities, unauthorized restrictions on hours of operation of the public access area, and general maintenance issues. And the port has been working with BCDC staff to address these existing compliance issues since 2021. Regarding potential sea level rise, using current site elevations, this map shows what 24 inches of sea level rise would look like if the site remained unchanged. Using the Ocean Protection Council's 2018 sea level rise guidance, 24 inches of sea level rise is equivalent to the mean higher high water level under the medium to high risk aversion high emission scenario at mid-century. At this level, there is some potential for overtopping on the site as indicated by these red lines along the shore, with potential for flooding at some of the lower lying areas just south of the beach. And this map shows what 66 inches of sea level rise would look like if the site was unchanged. This roughly corresponds to the mean higher high water level at 2090 in the medium to high risk aversion high emission scenario, as well as the 100-year storm condition at mid-century. In this scenario, areas of potential overtopping extend along the shoreline, and the beach and dunes are at risk of around 2 feet of flooding. So this slide just shows a summary of the conceptual site plan that the port presented to the DRB in July in 2021. Pursuant to the feedback received during the DRB meeting and other community outreach, the port made several changes to the design, including the addition of enhancements at Portview Park. And this slide shows the site plan that was shared at the March 21 DRB meeting, which to staff's understanding hasn't really changed for this meeting. Today, the port will be expanding on the DRB's March 21st discussions around planting and restoration ecology, special events, the beach, and sea level rise resiliency, and including an introduction of the draft of its Middle Harbor Shoreline Park Management Plan. So as you conduct your review tonight, please keep in mind the public access design guidelines, which emphasize usable and welcoming public space, visual access, connectivity along the bay shoreline, and compatibility with wildlife and adjacent port uses. And in addition, the staff report shared with you on September 1st provided several other topics that staff would like the board's advice on, which are summarized on the screen. These include the management plan and its options for organization structure and inputs for financial analyses, special events, including size, location, types, frequency, public access, programming areas, closures, and access routes, the planting strategy, and the proposed beach design. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions the board might have on the site context.
I have a question, but I'll wait for Chair, wait for you to ask for questions. I'm sorry.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine.
I just thought I'd let you know that I have a question.
Yeah, no, that's perfectly fine. Bob, go ahead.
Catherine, would you mind going back to the rendering, that one, I'm sorry, no. Go forward to the one we saw in July. In July,
In July, yes.
yeah, 12/20/21. Okay, this one. So this one shows a beach that's pretty wide. And it shows some dunes and then a strip of lawn. And then some kind of hardscape landscape areas. I'm focused on the beach, I'm sorry. So I'm looking at where the leader says expanded beach and education hub. And so I see a progression of a beach, narrow dunes, but some dunes. I think those are dunes. They look like, mounds. And then this kind of green strip of lawn. And then some palm trees and looks like kind of hardscape, kind of more traditional, park with grass and, pavement and stuff. Now, at that meeting, reviewing the minutes, and I think I was at that meeting, I think the DRB suggested that they look at a more natural setup, and, kind of more natural dunes and planting and stuff. Okay. So then if you could go to the next slide, the one we saw last time, I do see some more natural dunes and some boardwalks. And I think we kind of wanted to back off on the boardwalks a little bit, but the beach is like, there's this big beach over to the side and the lawn's kind of still there. And my recollection was that this wasn't what I expected to see at the second meeting. And I had concerns about the beach. Is that Catherine, is that your recollection? Or were you at the other meetings? I'm not sure.
Yeah,
I'm just trying to understand the trajectory here, Chair, if you don't mind, because this is a question for the staff, because I'm trying to understand what we're doing.
Andrea,
here.
go ahead, Andrea.
Yeah, so we did have a change in permit analyst, so I'll give Catherine a break.
Okay.
She probably
No, that's
wasn't
fine,
following
Catherine.
the project.
I'm doing this partly for the board because there seems to be some drifting here. And I think that what was missing is that, at least when I saw this the second time, it had moved in a direction that I did not anticipate. So that's the point I'm trying to make. And then yet now it's unchanged since the last time I saw it. So I just want to put that on the record.
Part of the change that's reflected in the beach is the addition of the Army Corps enhancement area beach proposal. So the beach expansion,
okay.
that's on the
Yeah,
March
that's really helpful
21st.
because we had no background last time. And so it's nice that they're providing the background. I really appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Right. And I also just want to recognize that the court is about to give a presentation and they can also probably add additional context
Right.
to the
Yeah.
question when
Andrea,
they present.
Yeah, that's a great point, Andrea. And Bob, we're going to see more details now from the next presentation. So great point. And let's come back to that once we see the additional details. Catherine, thanks for that. Any other clarifying questions from the board for Catherine? Okay. So with that, Catherine, perhaps you could continue and introduce the project team.
Sure. So today we have Jan Novak from the Port of Oakland, David Shiver from BAE, Linda Gates from Gates and Associates, and Russell Prange from WRA, who will be presenting. We'll also have Richard Sinkoff, Aaron McGregor, and Ramona Dixon from the port who will be available to answer questions. So I'll go ahead and pass it over to Jan to kick off their presentation.
Thank you, Catherine. Right now it says I cannot start my video because the host has stopped it. So thank you. Okay, great. Let's see, am I back? We had a quick question. We are looking to share the presentation and can you please give Michael Freitag permission to share his screen. Excellent. Okay. Well, thank you, Andrea and Catherine, for the overview. Andrea, thank you for hiking down from the glacier to join us tonight. That's a lot of work climbing up and a lot of work coming back down. So glad you made it back successfully. I'm Jan Novak. I'm the project manager for the Ports Master Plan update. I wanted to start by thanking BCDC staff for all their hard work on this project and documenting the history of the park. I wanted to thank the DRB for the first 2 rounds of review that they have provided. We've gained lots of constructive feedback through the process, and what you'll see tonight is the culmination of our work, and I hope that you like what you see. Next slide, please. So the overview of what we'll be presenting tonight, we'll start with a recap of the changes that we have proposed, and then David Shiver will be presenting the park management plan, which is new and exciting. Then Linda Gates from Gates and Associates will give an overview of event programming, and then we'll also present the planting and irrigation strategy moving forward. Next slide, please. So throughout this process, we started with the original master plan goals. We gathered public feedback and also DRB feedback throughout this whole process and came up with new goals. One of them, there's quite a bit of information on this slide, but I wanted to focus on the fact that we feel the park has a strong foundation to build on. We are now working on protecting and enhancing habitat, so that's a new restoration plan we'll be presenting tonight. We want to continue to highlight the amazing setting in which the Middle Harbor Shoreline Park is located, and our park is really focused on having sustainable operations moving forward, and David will highlight that in the management plan update. Next slide, please. So in order to move this plan forward in a feasible manner, and also to work well with BCDC staff and with our permitting obligations, we've subdivided the improvements into 3 different tranches. The first are the baseline improvements. These are what we would consider the basics. These are the things that once we get through the DRB process and move through the permit amendment process, we will be working on with our engineering team to move forward as quickly as possible. These are the things that bring the park up to a sustainable level and make it more usable for the current usership. And key areas that we'll be working on are the elevator that Catherine highlighted, the pathways. So that's a significant process of making sure that all the pathways are functioning correctly, and the education hub, and resurfacing of the wharf walkway. Next slide, please. From there, once we've completed that, we will hope to move on to the next phases, which will be level 1 and level 2. In video game speak, we would be leveling up. So we would be taking the basic park and adding new improvements, bringing in new user groups. So the key features that we would like to highlight here are the kayak launch, which hopefully will bring in more of the water using community, and the dog park, which would bring in folks who own dogs, which is a significant user group that has been, pardon the pun, but chomping at the bit. Well, I guess that's a horse pun, but chomping at the bit to use this park. And for habitat reasons, we have not allowed dogs in the past. So we're looking to create a dog park in an area of the park that is not in conflict with the important habitat values of the Middle Harbor Enhancement Area. And then, as Bob alluded to, there's also the the Middle Harbor Enhancement Area beach expansion, which we believe would make the beach area more usable to the general public as well. Okay, next slide, please. And this shows the baseline plus level 1 and level 2, all of the improvements put together. And now I'd like to pass the microphone over to David Shiver from BAE.
Thank you, Jan. My name is David Shiver. I'm a principal at BAE Urban Economics. And we were involved actually in the original planning and management plan for the park. And so we were asked to do an update. Next slide, please. So the management plan is basically we want to set up the framework for what we have in the plan. And we're really asking a set of questions. How much would it cost to improve the park? How would the park be managed and sustained over time? What kind of programs and events it would host? And what it would cost to operate the park annually, and as well as have reserves for future reinvestment. And really, the big question to ask is how would the park be sustained over time to remain a vital and usable and great urban park? Next slide, please. So the difference between what we've updated as a management plan versus a management agreement. So originally, East Bay Regional Parks, as you heard, operated the park, and they had, and the original master plan got into quite a detail in terms of agreement, contractual terms. This update is broader and more high level, and we're not getting into the nuts and bolts of what a management agreement would have. We're really looking at the big picture of how can you sustain it? What kind of programming can continue and or be expanded? What kind of revenues might it bring to help offset costs? And look at various options and revisit the options of how to manage the park. Next slide, please. So what's different from the update from the original management plan is, well, obviously it incorporates all the lessons learned that you've heard in terms of management and sustaining improvements. And so all that operational experience has been incorporated into the evaluation of management options and also the financial and budgeting for the park. And we paid a lot of attention and dug deeper into special events, given the history of special events and the desire to ensure that the park had access. And as part of that, we looked at other parks in the East Bay and also over in San Francisco and with GGNRA in terms of looking at what the potential is for special events. And obviously the plan reflects a reduced building program. Next slide, please. So the relationship between the updated master plan and the management plan is shown here visually. The master plan is really driving the management plan in the sense that the master plan has a major impact on obviously the capital improvement costs and the tiers that Jan explained, the operating costs because of the nature and change of the vegetation and landscaping and hardscapes, and then the capital reinvestment given the new improvements. We looking at that has a large impact in terms of capital reinvestment. And it also has something to say, a lot to say about governance model and also potential revenues. Next slide, please. So one of the things we did in our update, and it's in the draft report that you've seen, draft management plan, is we took and showed the detail in terms of cost estimates for the various components, the baseline improvements, level 1, and then baseline with level 1 and level 2. And then we, importantly, if you look at the bottom line, annual capital reserve costs, we calculated what is the useful life, and then what would be the annual contribution to a reserve fund that the port would have to make every year in order to ensure that the infrastructure and the systems of the park could be sustained over time. And so you can see that ranges from around 700,000 to almost 900,000 as you increase the level of improvements in the park. Next slide, please. So what we did in the updated plan is we viewed the park from several operational lenses, looking at preventative maintenance, utility costs, landscape maintenance, capital improvements, special events, security, educational programming, and permitting. And these blue boxes are kind of a visual cue that these are the core functions that the port has been doing, and we kind of replicate this through the options and allocate these different operational aspects and investment aspects of the park to partners that we evaluate as part of the governance options. Next slide, please. So the plan really looked at 3 options for long-term operation of the park. The first option is we looked at the continued direct port management, which is the status quo right now, but with enhanced scope for maintenance and perhaps programming. Option 2, we went back and said, well, perhaps we could go back to East Bay Regional Park District and have an agreement for them to manage the park in partnership with the port. So we analyzed that. The third option would be a partnership with a private entity, either a private foundation that's formed to support the park, or there are a couple for-profit park management entities. And so that is a model where it could be either nonprofit or for-profit private entity. And those are the 3 options that we evaluated and prepared budgets for. Next slide, please. So in the first option, which is looking at continued port management of the park after improvements, obviously all the functions, the blue boxes, stay with the port. And we noted various pros and cons associated with each option. So for the port continuing direct management, on the pro side, the port does have, long-standing community linkages and stewardship obligation to run the park. And the port staff has direct operational experience in managing the park and maintaining it. And they wouldn't incur any third-party administrative overhead costs from a financial aspect. And the port enjoys generally very good public relations. But on the negative side, or the cons, so to speak, the running a park and maintaining and protecting natural resources is really not a core port function. And maintenance has tended to be reactive over the last 20 years. And the educational program outreach and special event marketing has been limited because of the conflicts with port operations and the facilities as they exist. And lastly, the port has been subject to variations in its budget and revenue cycles, and the port's activities, as you know, are linked to the broader, not only our state, but national and global economy. And so they go through cycles in terms of funding. Next slide, please. So the next option is looking at the private management option. Here, the way we envisioned this option would be that the port would maintain and be responsible for capital improvements, both the initial ones and future replenishment, and also pay for utilities, provide and continue to provide security, and then do any kind of land use permitting functions there. And the private entity, the private management entity, would be responsible for marketing and operating special events, same with educational programming, and they would be responsible for both preventative maintenance and landscape maintenance under this scenario. And the advantages of this is you have, with a private entity, some potential to expand educational programming and special events perhaps to help generate revenue, offset costs. And with a private entity, they're promoting its activities, you might be able to increase overall visitation to the park. The disadvantage with this particular option is a high level of programming could conflict with the core port operations, which are busiest during the work week. And you might have higher costs associated with any kind of fees that are charged or overhead for an organization that you partner with. And you may have potential service quality issues or implications in terms, especially if you had a for-profit, they're motivated to make a profit. And so you'd have to carefully negotiate and document your management agreement with any such, or contract with any such entity. Next slide, please. So the last one we looked at was going back to East Bay Regional Parks District. Here, the port would still maintain capital improvements. They'd pay for utility costs and be the agency to do permitting. But East Bay Regional Parks picks up additional duty of providing security in addition to doing special events and educational programming and all the maintenance of the park. And the obvious advantage with this is running a park is a core function of our great East Bay Regional Parks District. And they have prior operating experience with the park. And they have potential to leverage their educational programs to enhance the programming at the Middle Harbor Shoreline Park and increase visitation through their district-wide marketing. The cons is we found this to be the more expensive option. You may have some limited potential from special events because that's not a core function of the park district. And the port would still have to cover all the capital improvement costs. And so that's our assessment for that. The next slide, please. So we prepared in detailed budgets, and there's narrative and assumptions all in the draft management plan that you have in your packet and have seen. And this is just a simple summary of it all. And the bottom line is, before you have your capital reserves taken into account, the operational costs of the park as improved would vary between about 1.7 and 2.2 million, depending on which option you went with. When you add the capital reserves to it all, your bottom line operating cost estimates range from around 2.5 to 3.1 million between the options, with the East Bay Regional Park District being more expensive, mainly because they charge their full overhead as part of their agreements. And you'd have the same going on with a private entity, but to a lesser extent. And the port we have as incremental costs, and so no charge of overhead in the port option. So that's why that ends up being a little lower. Next slide, please. We, as I mentioned at the beginning, we did take a hard look at special events. And special events have generated revenue that have lowered the cost to run the park, operate the park. And we reevaluated its potential. And the master plan, and working with the whole team to protect public access, we defined 3 levels of special events: small, medium, large, with small being around 50 to 1,000 attendees, medium 1,000 to 2,500, and then large in the context of this park would be 2,500 with a cap of 4,000. And these events could be ticketed events like music events, large weddings, corporate events, ceremonies, and the like. We also revisited the picnic table and the picnic reservation cost charging, and compared it to some other parks nearby, including the Park District in the city of Oakland. And we looked at commercial film permits and then fee education programs. And by fee education programs, I mean after school programs that parents pay for. And these organizations often pay a fee to the host location for the use of their facilities. And East Bay Regional Parks actually does this with various programs. Some of you may have heard of Sarah Science, no longer in business, but my son went there, and that's an example of that. And then we included discussions for concessions, but ultimately did not put in revenue from that, and I'll explain why in a moment. Next slide, please. So the key kind of vision and constraints that we put on special events was the need to balance the frequency and the size of events with the port operations, and then also to maintain public access of the park. And when you kind of add all the constraints up and you assess the park's potential for special events, we find that revenue would be on the modest side. But the big benefit of all the special events would be to, frankly, market the park and really put the park in residents' mental map. Just like the Presidio 30 years ago, nobody knew what was there or what it was. And now everybody say the Presidio, everybody knows it. So it's really putting it on the mental map of residents of the Bay Area. And so that's what we're hoping special events and educational programming can do for the park. Next slide, please. I'm not going to go into all the detail here, but we just wanted to show you that in preparing revenue estimates and special events, we went into a fair amount of detail in terms of the frequency per size. We looked at charges from other parks. We, as a company, BAE Urban Economics, we've worked since, gosh, 1992 with the National Park Service at Golden Gate National Recreation Area. We did Presidio planning and have worked with the East Bay Regional Parks District itself and other cities with park planning. And so we assess charges at the port's charging rate schedule. And so this just shows you some of the assumptions we made to come up with our estimate for special events revenue. We did not include any assumption for concessions. And the reason we didn't is even though the master plan provides for a future location for concessions, the track record is the visitation's low and you just don't have that critical mass of visitation to really support a concession. Now, with greater marketing and the improvements, this could change, but we assumed for the sake of being conservative on our estimates that we wouldn't have concessions, but it doesn't mean that it's not going to work. It just, I think, will take time. And people do get married at Middle Harbor Shoreline Park, as evidenced by our great photo. But it's a windy location. So even on that front, you know, there's some pluses and minuses with the park as a venue site. Next slide. So this is the end of my part of the presentation. And really all this does is it shows that special events revenue is going to be a modest source of revenue at best. It's ranging from perhaps 6 to 8% of your operating costs. And so when you kind of net out the revenue, and we kept the assumptions the same for the three options because we felt it was speculative to, and you get farther, you know, the more assumptions, the more room for error. We kept it constant just to see how it would reduce the net cost to operate the park. And so the bottom line, the last line, literally on this slide, is ranging from around 2.5 to almost $3 million. So just a very modest increase or decrease in the cost, but a lot of potential to get that park in people's mind as a great place to visit. And so I'll turn it over now to Linda Gates.
Thank you, David, very much. And so unfortunately, as we've discussed, the true value of these events is not in their revenue benefit, but in how they allow event visitors to discover this amazing resource and activate the park. The potential concessions can also enhance the visitor experience, allowing visitors to linger at the park. The concessions might also provide some economic benefit to local Oakland vendors. We imagine the concessions to take the form of food trucks that might come out on Friday nights during the summer, or a pop-up cafe in the existing train building at Portview Park. The train building already has an underutilized kitchen facility. Previously, there was not enough customers to justify this cafe. However, we hope as we introduce more visitors to the site via events and added activities such as dog walking, kayaking, and improved beach access, we will be successful with this venture. Next slide. Here's an example of how we might stage an event at the park while still allowing park visitors access to the beach, restrooms, play areas, and other picnic amenities. Event visitors arriving at the park would come via shuttle or rideshare. The focus of the events would be the oval space, which is a wind protected by the shade structure and the surrounding berms. Booths could be set up along Point Arnold. Portions of the parking area could be used for food trucks and production staging. Restrooms would be brought in for the event, so they wouldn't be sharing the park restrooms. Next slide. Non-event attendees arriving at the park would have access to parking area adjacent to restrooms along the promenade and at Point View Park. These 65 parking spaces could easily accommodate the casual park visitor use during events. Next slide. As we all know, one of the major challenges the park master plan recognizes is the need to create a self-sustaining planting strategy. When the park was first developed 20 years ago, it relied on acres of lawn. However, the high water requirements and the intensive maintenance associated with the lawn is just not sustainable. Furthermore, I think we all have a greater appreciation of the value of embracing natural coastal environments these days. So in exploring the plant palette, we wanted to use plants native to the Bay Area, but we wanted to recognize the impact of climate change and focus on plant species that have greater range to the south. We also wanted to think about plants that are appropriate to a park setting. They won't get so tall that their surveillance is compromised. With acres and acres of landscape, we wanted to make sure the plant palette would be efficient to establish and would be low maintenance in the long run. Next slide. Because of BCDC suggestions, we met with representatives from GGNRA, and they suggested we focus on plant materials that could survive in the existing sandy, fast-draining soils, rather than trying to significantly amend these soils and potentially encouraging weed growth. They suggested we work with specialists such as WRA to develop a planting strategy. Russell with WRA is here to answer any detailed questions you might have about our planting approach after my presentation. In order to create a naturally sustainable environment, we decided to model on 3 plant communities: coastal scrub, dunes, and grasslands. We used reference sites from the Presidio, Nolan Park, Albany Beach, and Marin Headlands to identify appropriate plant palettes. Next slide. We then identified appropriate location for these various plant palettes on the site, with the exception of new trees that will be added to provide wind buffer and to scale the spaces. The only lawn on the site would be in the oval. Everything else would be based on these 3 plant communities. Our goal is to ultimately have a landscape that can survive without irrigation, except in those areas adjacent to restroom and drop-off and the lawn area. Those areas may require more, because they're more intensely used, may require supplemental irrigation to survive. Next slide. As you recall, we have dredged soils. And so we went out and pulled 12 soil samples, and they consistently found the site is comprised of very sandy, high soils with a high infiltration rate, high salinity, and poor nutrition levels. We realized that it would require a partnership with a restoration company for 3 to 5 years at a minimum to successfully establish a thriving plant communities. We would need to begin with harvesting collection of the appropriate seeds, pre-treatment of the site to remove any invasive weeds and non-natives, and then much of the site would be planted with seeds, broadcast or drilled, and some materials we brought in with plugs or liners. We recognize that we will need to reseed and replant in some areas and provide ongoing maintenance to remove herbicides during this establishment period. Next slide. We also recognize that we may need to provide supplemental irrigation during the establishment period. While for the mole, we are proposing to seed in the fall and hopefully establish with natural rainfall. On the majority of the site, we would repurpose the existing irrigation system to provide temporary irrigation during that establishment period, slowly weaning it off. As I mentioned before, the lawn areas and some areas right adjacent to the restroom and drop-off would have permanent irrigation. Next slide. So here's our proposed plant palette. There's a matrix of this. I'm not going to go through every plant material with you, but in general, it identifies trees, shrubs, grasses, and herbs associated with the various coastal communities that are linked to where we would plant them on the site. It identifies the appropriate planting techniques, densities, appropriate method for planting, water use, and habitat value. And with that, I think I'll turn it over for any questions you may have.
Okay, Linda, thank you very much. So our next step here is for the board to ask clarifying questions from the project presentation, and that's from all of the presenters. So if you can raise your hand for questions. Tom, please lead off.
Hi, thanks for presentation. Very thorough. I'm looking at the preliminary financial summary and this careful evaluation of the different management scenarios, and on one hand, then also the different levels of baseline improvements from baseline up to level 2, and understanding that the potential from revenue from events between 6 to 8%, it's not a lot, but it helps. So it boils down to between 2.5 million to 3 million to do both capital improvements and to manage it each year. So that basically the park needs between 2.5 and 3 million each year. That's the first part of my question.
Yeah, I should say that there's the initial capital outlay. So what you have, the financial summary is expressing the financial commitment after you make the initial set of improvements. And
Okay.
the capital reserves are an annual set aside not to fund the initial, but to recapitalize them down the road.
Right.
So that's the big difference. So in
So you
addition,
do need between 2.5 to 3 million each year as you supplement the capital reserves.
yeah,
Okay.
and a portion of those dollars go into reserve fund.
Yeah. And then there is the actual capital improvement of the whole park at the beginning at whichever level. And I guess what I'm leading up to is, where does the money come from, given that the events aren't going to cover that much? Is a combination of port operating budget and or grants? And if it's grants, are the things that could be done to make this the most attractive possible grantee?
Jan, I'll defer to you for the funding of the initial improvements.
Right. And I see that Aaron McGregor, who's our project manager from Maritime Division, is here. Ultimately, the port has 3 revenue divisions. We have maritime, commercial real estate, and aviation. And this park is tied to the Maritime Division. So our Maritime Division is responsible for the financial health of the park. And our Maritime Division is committed to moving this park forward successfully. Aaron, if there's anything you would like to add, please do.
Sure, thanks, Jan. No, that's a great question. And I think David hinted a little that, part of this would be to siphon off capital reserves each year to ensure sustainment of the park over time, considering the life cycle of these assets that we're proposing to invest in. With respect to funding, we have just recently published our 5-year CIP, and we have included in that CIP, which has been approved by our board, sufficient funds to cover the baseline improvements proposed, as well with a contingency. So the port is committed to financially making this investment to ensure that capital improvements are delivered in the manner that is reflected as engineering design progresses, and that those funds have been allocated to date. Obviously, this is a very high level design. We understand we'll be coming to BCDC to have a material permit amendment. As part of that process, that would demand relatively or roughly 30% design concepts, which would allow us to more fine tune the cost estimates for these improvements, which is why we've included contingency in our capital improvement plan. Any additional?
One quick follow-up. So
Sure.
I heard the part about the capital improvement, the baseline improvements, but for the maintenance that's a yearly commitment. And does that also work the same way, coming from?
Yeah, so sorry for cutting you off there, Tom. The way the port structures its budgets is we have a capital budget and we have an operating budget. So
Okay.
in terms of the ability to provide a demonstration that the port has allocated funding to sustain operations, that would come in our operating budget. And obviously that's not updated until these improvements are realized. And so you wouldn't see those figures. I think they're in the $2.5 million range for the base life improvements for a few years until these projects start to put shovels in the ground and manifest kind of these exhibits we've been walking through.
One quick little thing. So have you all decided on the management scenario you want to pursue, or are you going to let things go further along to resolve that?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I anticipated that coming up in some form. So at this stage, we've been securing public input on how they would like to see the park managed and by what entity. And that's obviously a key consideration. Our stakeholders in the way they envision this park being managed and who they think the best actor to do that is. So that's one form of feedback. The next thing we will be doing, and this is part of our permit amendment with BCDC, is we will be having third-party review of the management plan. And so currently we've secured a commitment from the City of Oakland Parks and Rec Department to review it. Obviously, they have more experience in managing parks than we do as an operating seaport. And we've also been engaged with executive leadership at East Bay Regional Parks District. In particular, we want their review, and that review would not just be limited to, providing comments on this document. It would also be to engage in conversations of what a potential and mutual partnership could be like. So we see them as a potential actor, as well as the City of Oakland, as well as the park and a third party. But we do want to acknowledge that we think some of the importance of this park is that it's a regional park. And so the regional nature and attraction of it lends itself maybe in particular to certain management entities and others. But fundamentally, we haven't made that decision. It's going to be a two-way street, right? And so we'll be having conversations, and we'll be diligent about meeting with our BCDC colleagues and keeping them apprised, and continue to secure their input on this decision.
Great, thank you so much.
No problem.
Okay, thanks, Tom. Bob, you have your hand up.
I do, but I thought Kristen had her hand up. I was going to let her go first. Kristen, didn't you have your hand up? Or
I did, but Tom actually asked the question I was going to ask. So
okay,
thank
all
you.
right. All right, well, I guess I'll go forward then, if that's okay, Chair.
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you.
Cinta, can I just add one more comment before Bob jumps in? So the last thing I want to say, I think Tom alluded to, the potential for foundations or philanthropic interest in providing an additive revenue stream for the port. And obviously, like, that's one of the things I think David could speak to with greater authority than myself. But certain institutions already have independent nonprofit or 501c3 organizations that are focused on securing various forms of funding streams to support their operations and investment in capital equipment and other things. So I think that, if we think that is a substantial potential revenue vehicle for the park, that's one of those considerations that would maybe influence going with the private party, or maybe in East Bay Regional Parks, because they have a separate foundation. I think the Presidio does too. David, can you articulate that in ways that I can't?
Yeah, I think you hit the key points on that particular option. I think the park, for these foundations to be successful, you have to have really strong constituency and a board that can raise substantial funds. And you'd also have the setup period in terms of getting the organization going. And I think that for this park might be more challenging. And so we put it in because we wanted to recognize that the for-profit entities are a consideration, but they, the closest one is one that was, what was it? It was American Land Management Company had a contract for Brandon Island. They pulled out. And so they're not an urban park, manager. So that option, I think, would be, of the three, is probably the more challenging, because to get a foundation and a private entity set up, running, and with the capacity to get grants and fundraise could be challenging. And there's, a lot of competition. East Bay Regional Parks has a foundation. You've got obviously the Golden Gate National Parks Conservancy out there. And so there's lots of successful models, but the question is, would it work here?
Okay, thank you, David and Aaron. Bob, we'll come back to you. Go ahead with the question, clarifying question, Bob.
Okay, thank you. So my question is for Linda Gates, that presented the vegetation, or anyone else. I was a little, you kind of lost me a little bit where you talked about using more native plants, and then went to the soil analysis, which indicated a requirement for substantial amendments and other treatments. And I'm wondering if that analysis had to do with the more kind of lawn and non-native plants, or was the soil amendments and all of that also intended to be used for the dunes, for the dune planting?
So, right, yes. So that's a good question, because when we first had the analysis done, they suggested a lot of amendments to the soils to get plant established. And then we met with Gigi and Ari out there, and we're walking the site, and they were sharing with us what they had found that worked better for them was to not do a lot of amending in the soils, to really focus on plants that could survive in that setting. As you walk out there, I mean, they're not thriving, but there are plants beginning to establish themselves out there with no nurturing whatsoever. And the idea was actually, maybe, as you're saying, to do much more emphasis on plants that didn't require very much supplemental amendment to the soil, that really could work in that kind of area. And that emphasis, like that sort of whole self-sustaining environment. So the amendment would be more in the lawn area. And as I said before, like around restroom and stuff, where you get so much pedestrian traffic that sometimes it's hard to get something without a little bit extra something to establish.
Well, yeah, thank you for that clarification. Just something you might find interesting. There's a group called the Dune Network that's operating primarily on the Pacific coast of California, but they're quite active in addressing these issues. Again, I'm not sure how the Sea Grant, University of Southern California Sea Grant is associated with them, and I can give you names, or I can give them to the staff. But they're really focused on using dunes as natural shore infrastructure for adaptation to sea level rise and resilience. And there's a very strong preference towards not using a lot of traditional irrigation and soil amendments for native dune plants. And there are a range of different plants that can be used to give you different morphologies, or different geometries, some that result in steeper slopes and some that result in the kind of the low hummocks. And anyway, that's good to hear. And I think one of the reasons why we had recommended looking at more natural plantings before is because it seemed that would be a lower cost in terms of ongoing maintenance, and provide some other benefits that may make the park, even if only a portion of it was planted with natives, make the park more attractive to a broader range of people.
I absolutely agree. And I'd love that information, because we've been reaching out to all sorts of people, and so is WRA, really about different success stories in establishing. And I think that it's a longer commitment to establishment period, but ultimately a thriving system. It's just that.
And you have to control access to some degree.
Yeah, all that stuff.
But anyway, I'm happy to follow up on that if somebody wants to ping me, and I'm happy to go through the staff. But
thanks, Bob.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bob.
Thank you.
Terrific. Really helpful. Gary, your hand's up.
Yeah, just briefly, this is all this restoration strategy seems really promising. So very exciting to me. Um, this side gets a little less fog than the GGNRA, and then also we have our drought issue. Did they mention anything about how they? I mean, this has been a really great strategy that they've proven works, but now we have these additional factors. So do you have to wait for a wet year, or how do you mitigate? Because I mean, even native plants sometimes have trouble in this particular, climate situation that we're in these last few years.
Well, and that's why I mentioned that we do have an irrigation system that's not in use right now that we may need to come in, because you don't want things to just start to be working and then we get this 110-degree weather and we lose a whole thing. So we may in that, first 3 to 5 years need to kind of provide some supplemental irrigation to nurse things along. So not really to establish it with it, but to, to carry us over those hard times, but ultimately turning it off.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you. Yeah, I realize that's a great strategy to have the irrigation. And I guess I was just curious if long-term drought has any additional challenges, because, these plants are drought tolerant because they send down deep roots and they find some cool, moist earth. And, when you have long-term drought over a long period of time, you don't have that reservoir of moisture in the soil anymore. So anyway, I think that there are a lot of super interesting things that are gonna be discovered, and I'm very interested to see how you crack
Me
this.
too. I think it's going to be exciting. Whole
Okay,
documentary.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you very
Gary.
much.
Let's all keep in mind, these are clarifying questions right now. We're not in the discussion stage. Bob, not Bob. If we could go to Kristen, please.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. It was really helpful to hear all the background on the economic analysis and all of that, how the events have worked in the past, how they will work potentially in the future. I had sort of two mundane questions about programming. The first one is, will you be providing any electrical hookups anywhere, any sort of infrastructure that would help events be a little bit more successful if that's part of the plan? And then the other question is just around dogs. It sounds like there's a big constituency that would love to have dogs here. Are dogs only allowed in the park? Are they allowed on leash in other places? What's the kind of programming around that?
Yes, thank you, Kristen. Great questions. The DRB did mention electrical at the last meeting, and I believe that's something that we would be looking into having some sort of availability of outlets so that events wouldn't have to bring generators, for instance. So I think that's in line with other work we're doing in the Seaport area. The current park rules are no dogs allowed. And legend has it that when Jerry Brown came out to the park, when he was mayor of Oakland, he was very frustrated because he came out with his dogs and he found out that no dogs were allowed, and he was not happy with that decision. But that ruling had to do with the Middle Harbor Enhancement Area, which is to provide foraging habitat for the federally endangered California least tern, and at the time the federally threatened brown pelican. So the fear was that dogs would chase away the foraging birds. So when we sat down and looked at how to, and so that was the initial design, but over the years, the community has consistently brought up their desire to bring dogs out there. And when we did surveys for the Middle Harbor Enhancement Area, about 10% of the participants stated that they bring their dogs out there anyways. And most likely they have them off leash because there are no rules out there. So we thought that if we do establish a dog park, then there would be rules around dogs, and folks would be more inclined to follow the actual rule, bring their dogs to the park. And then we'd have the walkway in the least utilized part of the park for folks to walk their dogs on leash. So that's kind of the thinking around there. We also that might have an indirect benefit of helping to reduce the Canada goose population that we currently have out there, which is which is I would say overly thriving. So they've become a real nuisance species, and it's actually at this point kind of a public health issue. I don't know if you've read in the papers that Foster City, they're looking to cull some of their Canada goose population, and there's been a lot of public outcry. But they have a similar issue where these geese are they're they're vegetarians. They eat all the grass. They're eating the eelgrass actually in the Middle Harbor Enhancement Area, and they just poop everywhere. So and Ramona can talk to this more thoroughly, but for several months of the year, the park is literally just covered in goose feces. So having dogs nearby could have the benefit of maybe keeping the Canada geese from spending as much time in the park and breeding in the park area. So anecdotally, I've seen nests out there. So we're looking to make the park more inhabitable. I mean, we love the shorebirds. We just don't want as many of the Canada geese. So they're kind of the nuisance species. So I hope that addresses your comments or your questions.
It does, thank you.
Yeah, and I can just add on here. We do have programming for additional electrical infrastructure. It's currently, I believe, considered kind of a level 2 improvement, but we've always considered a level 1/level 2, depending on who becomes the long-term manager of the park and what their aspirations are for special events, because that's when it would have its greatest impact. It would be allowed for, not carting in all this additional infrastructure to supply sound, lights, etc. So it's, a lot of things with this process is chicken or egg. Like, until we know who manages the park long-term, until we can define and operationalize those priorities, it's very challenging to determine what bucket an investment falls in. So we've kind of really focus those level 1 improvements on things that are most consistent with public feedback and are reflective of the permit requirements that we have currently.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Stefan, clarifying question?
Sure, thank you, Jacinta. I just have a question regarding the 7th Street Connector project. Is there any geographical overlap between that project and these improvements? And if so, could you sort of illustrate those on the map, or are these sort of truly 2 adjacent projects that will occur?
So the overlap that we do have that we presented at the last ERB was work on the edge condition. So to make the park more, to work on so you have the intersection on 7th Street that allows pedestrians and cyclists to come into the park. And we want to make that the entranceway more accessible to cyclists. So I think that is the main overlap. Other than that, they're fairly independent, but they're working, they're working in concert with the task of making the park more amenable to the public.
Thank you.
Okay.
Stefan, sorry, I just wanted to add that BCDC staff decided to have the 7th Street Connector come at a separate meeting so that we could focus on park improvements at this meeting. But it was originally presented to us together. So, and the 7th Street Connector, or a park connector, is a part of the permit. So there is that requirement as well. But we just thought it was better to give more time to the park improvements in this meeting and then have the connector discussion in the next meeting.
Thank you, Andrea.
Great. Thanks, Andrea. Look, I'd like to ask a couple of questions. The first 2 are for David, clarifying questions. The first question on, I think it's page 43 of the management plan. It's a question about the operations overhead, and East Bay Regional Park's overhead is 41.6%. David, can you just break down how does that operational overhead break down? What's included in it?
On page 43, the detailed budget that we have here,
Yeah.
And then which item were you inquiring about?
It's the East Bay Regional Park District, the operations overhead. It's about 10 lines down, and it says, base cost 41.6%.
Oh, the overhead?
Yeah. What's the breakdown of the overhead for the parks? What's included in it?
Oh, let's see. Well, we worked with the park budget, their whole budget. And they divide, as you know, or you may know, is they have all the units, all the park units. And if this was part of that, it'd be the Shoreline Park unit. So all the system-wide costs are included in the overhead. And I believe I may have to follow it up with an email response in writing, but there's other components. I believe they have some of their pension obligation money in there. It's a pretty high rate, but the port actually has, and other public agencies have pretty high general overhead rates that arise from all the administrative and kind of back office functions, along with some of the employee pension obligation functions. But I can follow it up with a more detail for you.
Yeah, look, if you wouldn't mind, I just think it's important to be comparing apples with apples, and I did see reference to the port pension, pulled out separately in the budget, but I think it would be helpful to see that. So thanks for that. And then, David, a second clarifying question, because you're very familiar with East Bay Regional Parks. Are there other parks in the network of parks in the East Bay Regional Parks where there is land ownership that's similar to, and that has an outside agency like the port that owns one of the other parks and it's being maintained by East Bay or regional parks, or, who typically owns the land that they're managing?
Yeah, I know with the Golden Gate National Recreation Area, actually, there are parts within the park boundary. There's portions of it that the state parks runs, like Angel Island, but even though it's part of the park district. So you do see these kinds of arrangements where the entity running the park may not actually, own the park. So.
Yeah, I mean, I would find it useful to just see if there was some type of other example of a park that East Bay Regional Parks is managing, where the land is not owned by.
That they specifically don't own.
Yeah,
Okay.
right.
Yeah, I didn't look at their park units that way, but we could go back and we can take a look at it.
Yeah, it's really a land ownership question, and just to see whether there might be some dynamics, lessons learned that could come from that example. And then
Jacinta, the Martin Luther King Shoreline is land owned by the port and is managed by East Bay Regional Park District.
Yes.
Great, that's a good example then.
Yeah.
Okay, because that could be something that could play into just an evaluation of how these cost options compare. And then look, the third question I think is probably to I don't think it's to David, but it's really, I just want to circle back to the first series of questions that Tom asked. And, there is a basic operating, maybe it's to Aaron, a basic operating component to the budget by the port, 2.5 million, maybe 3 million, just annual funding for maintenance, separate to the capital budget. And I mean, just from a risk going forward standpoint and looking at what may not have been able to happen successfully in the past 15, 20 years, have there been years where the $2.5 to $3 million just wasn't available because of economic forces? I'm just trying to understand what really contributed to the deterioration in the maintenance to the park. Have there been years of no funding? What are the risks that really need to be addressed looking out from ahead?
David, do you want me to take that first?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I mean, there were some acute macroeconomic shocks that the port experienced, as well as increased needs for, operating budgets from East Bay Regional Parks historically. So we had the global financial crisis. I think Richard could jump in. There's Ports America and a few other things that were totally unpredicted, that had at a macro level, that had a very strong impact at a local level in terms of our operations. I can't sit here and say those macroeconomic issues will never occur again. I mean, we're kind of getting out of a pandemic that we never expected to live through. But that said, you know, I think that there's two things that the port is committing to. One is like putting these dollars, allocating them in their CIP. And obviously, if there's some global shock or uncertainty that manifests, like resources have to be prioritized. Additionally, when we think about what if the port did not continue to be the governance or management entity of this park? Well, someone would most likely say, well, what happened? You used to have another operator and then you took it back over, and the level of financial commitment to the park went down. So just from a transactional perspective, to incentivize any other third party to commit to taking over operations at the park, that would likely require something like an endowment, where we actually are putting a stack of capital down that can be drawn on through interest over time and provide some multi-decadal security to whoever joins a partnership with the port. So these things are not lost on us, and they're not trivial. And at this point, we don't want to be here 10 years from now having the same conversation, right? So part of this is not just thinking critically about the improvements to make a sustainable park so we don't find ourselves in this place again, but also thinking about what we can do in terms of institutionalizing financial structures so we're not in this place again. David, you probably have more to add. I think you were involved in the development of the park when I was a sophomore in high school, so you've got a few more years to draw from, but you've kind of seen this time series play out.
Yeah, and I think if the part of the issue too is irrigation system, you know, and with the sandy soils, it really became costly to maintain these plantings in sandy soil. And that's been a big part of why the park, you know, migrated to the current state. It was very, very hard to maintain, and you had droughts where you'd have to use a lot of water. So when you kind of put all that together, that led to issues in maintenance and whatnot, in addition to all the economic factors. So, I mean, that's what I've observed.
Okay, thanks very much.
And I would point out on your prior question regarding the 41%, there's a footnote on the next page at the bottom that explains the composition of the 41%, and I provide more detail. That shows it's footnote D.
Yeah.
And so I can provide more detail on those line items about what it means, because I think you got dispatch in there, for example.
Right.
You know, as a cost.
Yeah. Thanks for pointing that out. Thank you. Okay, I don't think there are any more clarifying questions. I really appreciate the dialogue there. So I think with that, we will move to public comment, hand it back to the staff. Is Andrea still there?
Yeah, it looks like Nancy Nadell has her hand raised. Let's see, I can go ahead and allow you to talk. Please introduce yourself and state your affiliation, and you have 3 minutes to talk.
Thank you. Nancy Nadell, I'm a West Oakland resident, former city council member. I'm addressing the Chappelle Roland Hayes Memorial Observation Tower elevator. It is amazing that there has not been a disability access lawsuit in the 15 years it's been out. I did not see anything in the original budget slide about the repair and maintenance of the elevator. I've been asking for repair for 15 years and it has been out for that long. And that was long before COVID and any other economic stresses that were previously mentioned. I'm curious as to the timeline for the repair. I would request that BCDC require a short timeline. Not only is the elevator out, but there's also disrespectful graffiti, not only on the elevator, but on the plaque of my husband, who was Chappelle Rowan Hayes, now deceased. If you want more community involvement and attendance, it would be nice to better publicize the tower's name. Naming it after a community member was to encourage the community to want to participate and see it and learn about his environmental work, which I think would be wonderful to include in the educational program. I do like the idea of an endowment for the facility, for the entire park. And I, again, encourage you to require a short timeline for the repair of the elevator. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Andrea, can the port respond to Ms. Nadell's comments?
Yeah, I think you have a plan, so please elaborate.
Thank you, Ms. Nadell, for your comments. We take them seriously and appreciate the service of yourself and your partner to the community of Oakland and the broader East Bay region. I do want to let you know that it may sound disingenuous since it's been out of operation so long, the elevator, but we have actually, we have allocated funding. It was aggregated into the geographic unit. I think it's the mole area for this investment and this improvement to assure accessibility by all parties. And I want to stress that I was literally working on a task order today to develop a scope of work for this specific project. So we are actually carving out the improvement of the elevator from all the other improvements that have been proposed today, and we'll be hiring a specific consultancy to advance those design considerations and get shovels in the ground as soon as possible. So I know it's been too long, and we are gonna, we've definitely made a financial and time commitment to prioritize this, and appreciate your input. Respect.
And I want to add from the BCDC perspective, it was specifically itemized in the recent settlement agreement. And we have been working with the port to resolve this issue and find an appropriate design to incorporate it to provide the accessibility to the upper levels. So thank you for your comments.
Andrea, are there any other comments?
There are no other public comments.
Okay, thanks, Ashley. And I do appreciate that comment as well, so thank you. Okay, with that, we will move to board discussion and advice. And just remind everyone, apart from board members, if you could please turn off your cameras so the board can have a focused discussion. And I also just want to lead in with a couple of points. I'm very, I think a couple of you said this, but I'm really encouraged by the level of seriousness that the port is taking in preparation of the management plan and refining a master plan, taking a look forward approach in terms of changes that will produce a more sustainable park for the next 20 years. And if you look back on the last 20 years, you can just see how much has changed in the context of the park, climate change, different approaches to landscape, sustainability, and other important factors. So it's really great to see this work moving forward. Having said that, I was also very encouraged to hear the comment about the Canada geese, for example, because the condition of the park and not to be humorous about this, but it does seem that it's almost more a bird park right now than a park for human beings. So I really think some of these management aspects to get the right balance between nature and people and is very important going forward. So we are going to have a conversation now where we always keep in mind the 7 objectives for public access that we really want to make sure are kept front of mind in whatever work is going on in the future for this park, making public access as public as possible, making public access usable, maintaining visual access, enhancing the visual quality of the bay and the shoreline, providing connections and continuity along the shoreline, taking advantage of the bay setting, and making sure that public access is compatible with wildlife. And the staff have asked us to look at 4 questions specifically, and as always, we can add other aspects into this, but I think for the sake of the discussion, let's organize it around these topic areas. So the first one focuses on the management plan. The second area focuses on special events, which of course are given a lot of attention within the management plan, but let's separate out that conversation on special events. The third area is the planting strategy, and the fourth is the proposed beach design, so the current proposal. So let's start with the management plan, and we've been asked to discuss the organizational structure options and also the considerations for inputs into the financial analyses, for example, maintenance or management use and so on. So let's just start with the management plan, and just your reaction to it. It can be a high-level reaction or something very specific. Who wants to lead off? Okay, Kristen.
I really appreciated the bringing that management plan. I think this is something that we've talked about quite a bit in the past, and so it was really helpful to hear what your thoughts are on that and the different options that you're exploring. And I really also appreciated the honest discussion about the pros and cons of bringing a third party and how it sort of requires you to dedicate some funds if there's a third party in a way that's maybe a little bit more substantial than if you were to continue to operate it yourselves. Just a few thoughts on that is, I think if you did decide to bring in a third party, it would be probably helpful to have the input from them on the plans before you go and do the capital improvements, because they may have some insights into certain operational ideas, like we talked about the electrical outlets or things like that, that may make operations more successful or easier. And then the other thing that I would be, that could be interesting to understand from them is a plan for advertising the park for events. I think making sure that there's some resources dedicated to marketing and advertising the opportunity and availability of the park for events would be, probably helpful in its life as a revenue generator.
Yeah.
And then just one more point on the outlets. It's just more sustainable and cleaner energy to have electrical available rather than diesel generators running all the time. So if that is a possibility, I think that's a nice environmental bonus.
Yeah.
Those were the only comments I had on that.
Okay. Tom, go ahead.
So just reiterating, Jacinta, what you said, I think this was really a model response by an applicant. We had a meeting not that long ago in March, and we made some specific points, and they responded on all those things carefully and thoroughly. And so I just want to applaud the real serious effort that's gone into that. And also, like Kristen said, it seems that this is going to go forward. And we just had a very frank discussion about how priorities work financially and what to expect. And I think that's kind of let the cards are on the table. It's very valuable interaction with Port in this meeting. So I'm very hopeful for the future. One thing I would wonder or hope whether there's any chance for sponsorships in a situation like this. You know, I mean, I don't think any big major donor is going to come in, but would there be some people that would be possible to endow certain parts of this project, even in terms of maintenance, because maintenance is always the hardest thing to get anybody to pony up for. I have a planting comment. I'll save it for later.
Okay, thanks, Tom. Bob.
Thank you, Chair McCann. Yeah, I just have a quick comment. And I have to say I haven't vetted this, but I've been a little confused and concerned that the beach augmentation is not part of the Middle Harbor Shoreline Project. There's various references to the Middle Harbor Environmental MHEA, whatever that is, and the Army Corps of Engineers taking care of the beach, and the beach being something else and not part of this project that we're reviewing. But however, I think the staff and potentially a settlement agreement did mention improvements to the beach. So my comment on the financial plan is I would like confirmation that the beach, whether it's capital or maybe not, because maybe the Corps of Engineers is going to pay for it, or at least the maintenance is part of the plan. That's my only comment.
Yeah. Okay, Bob. Yeah, no, it's an important point. And, you know, there is a question 4, which is specifically about the beach for us to discuss, but, you know, we should make sure that as you say, that whatever costs associated with the beach are clearly embedded in the plan. Gary?
Yeah, I completely agree with what I'm hearing from everyone. I think it's a lot trickier to work out the management and the maintenance than it is to do the installation. And you can see a lot of good money going down the drain very quickly if that management plan is not in place and really worked out. So I think this is just incredible what you've done. I totally agree with Tom. So that's encouraging. I know it's not going to be easy, but I really like the direction that all this is headed. In terms of the management, the model for the management is kind of a question. Maybe Tom, you have some thoughts on it, but there is that, well, it's hard to know whether this is an urban park or a rural park. There's a lot of open space that seems like it could be something that East Bay Regional Parks could deal with. I think of them as being more, and I could be wrong, but I think of them as being more able to manage a more, more pastoral, more rural park. But parts of this are really heavily programmed, with the parking and the events and garbage cans and outlets and all that. That seems to fall into what is maybe a slightly different category. And I'm thinking about that company that started the management of Bryant Park in New York and kind of converted it from what was a really problematic needle park into, one of the most successful open spaces in America. And as a result of their success and the nonprofit they started to manage it, they have started managing parks and open space all over the country, including Salesforce Park. So that, maybe that's overkill. And I know that one of the things they do is that they really count on making the open spaces revenue generating to pay for their fees. So it kind of goes hand in hand with the events, like they really try to get that aspect going and really look for creative ways to generate income. So I can't remember their name right now, but I could find out. And I don't know if Tom, you know anything about that, but this is kind of
like, it's John. It's John Alschuler, HRNA.
I thought you were talking about Biederman.
I think it might be Biederman. Yeah.
Biederman Redevelopment Associates.
I think you'll find, anyway, there's a couple of people there who are very good at doing this sort of thing.
I'm sure there are more than one company.
Yeah.
And I'm just thinking of it as an educational opportunity. Like, how do you help? How do you come to a decision? And it sounds like the port has not really found, direction yet. I don't know if that's true or not, but if it's completely open-ended, maybe there's a little bit more input that's needed from the people who actually do the management and see what they what they think.
Yeah.
I think they could do an evaluation for you.
Stefan?
Thanks, Jacinta. My only comment sort of on the management structure, what I would sort of second what everybody else is saying. What comes to mind for me is there's a potential for sort of a large scale landscape restoration that we could say is a little bit unprecedented for the entities sort of in this region. There's the restoration of that piece, but then there's also the ongoing maintenance, which is also something that sort of hasn't really been tested. It seems it's important to consider whoever does this has the institutional knowledge to do it or learn it, but then also would be willing to apply that in other places. And because I think that there are, I'm sure, other locations within the East Bay that would be benefiting from this knowledge. And so I think that's just maybe something in my mind to consider, because an outside entity may have sort of a specialty, but there probably will be an ongoing need to adapt additional park spaces across the Bay Area within the East Bay Regional Park District to this model of native drought tolerant, resilient plants. And so I think just thinking about who's going to be carrying that forward and sort of helping adapt these spaces in the future, where is that institutional knowledge going to rest, seems to be something that I probably would value as a pro and sort of consider, even if it meant that that model might actually be a more a greater financial investment for this partnership. And then so anyway, I think that's the only point I want to make regarding the management, but it seems like that's sort of an important consideration.
Yeah. Thanks, Stefan. I'm just going to comment on a couple of things. We were asked to consider the organizational structure options. I think everyone thinks that's a very strong part of the management plan and supportive of this. And the thing that I liked about it was the comment the port made that this was not a foregone conclusion, that there would be an iterative process that would, with the community involved, that would ultimately determine which way they go. And it made me think of something else in the presentation, which I think I would have stated slightly differently. There was a diagram that the consultant showed of, the master plan with all the steps along the management plan process, and the master plan has a one-way arrow driving everything. And I think it should actually be more of a two-way arrow going, backwards and forwards, just like iterating on the options or the organizational structure options. There should be iteration back with the master plan, because I think one of the things that could be a potential risk going forward, for example, is the assumption that over a 20-year period, if you look in the capital plan, 20 or 30 years, 15 years assumed for, some of the different capital items, everything from benches, up to, and if you look at the other end of it, it's, the restrooms, for example, which are challenged with maintenance right now. And you look at that structure and you look at the view structure, and there comes a point where, do you just accept that for the next 20 years you go out and you paint bollards, and you, repair the bench for 20 years? Or do you make some choices about, maybe looking forward, we can let some of these capital items go, and then, make sure that we're even providing for replacement of certain items, or substantial renovation of if you look at a restroom gets very hard usage in a public park. And so, is it just about going in and doing as needed repairs, or you know, halfway through, do you go in and really redo the stalls, and you know, or do you look at the structure itself and how can you improve it? So I would like to see the management plan and the master plan actually iterating and looking forward, so that, because there were clearly a number of aspects of the original master plan that were never realized for a variety of reasons, or might have been realized, but are not actually serving the future use of the park that effectively. You know, a number of the barbecues are sort of, you know, they need maintenance, but if you're going to repair it, do you come in and actually replace it with something that might be a little more durable looking forward? So these are the sorts of questions that could actually enhance revenues from the park to make some of these places a little more attractive for people coming in for events. I don't know what others think about that. Any thoughts on that point? Does that make sense? Okay.
Sorry, Jacinta, can I ask you for some clarification on that? Are you saying that there should be sort of an evaluation process built into the management plan for either replacing or just maintaining the capital improvements? Is that what you're saying?
I didn't quite hear what you said, but what I'm saying is, over the course of, if you look at the capital plan, you know, it's assumed that, which is a reasonable thing to assume, you know, a bench will last for 20 years, something like that. But if you think about some of the things that the port is currently doing from a maintenance standpoint, you know, do you replace all of the litter receptacles, for example, with something that is a little more maintenance resilient, or a little more useful for looking forward? So I presume in the upgrades to the park that a lot of this will be addressed, but I think I don't think in looking ahead for the next 20 years, with a number of those elements of the park having already been there for 20 years, that you can assume that you're just going to keep maintaining an object rather than upgrading it or replacing it. Does that make sense?
Andrea, could I respond to that? I don't know how the rules work. We have rules, right?
I usually don't interject, but because I'm taking notes and trying to help this process, I wanted a little bit more clarification on it.
I'd hate to jump in, but I'd prefer personally as a board member if we could just move on with the agenda and get it done. Right. And I think the port has an opportunity to respond later. It's up to the chair, but that's my vote, if you don't mind.
Yeah, look, we'll move on. Andrea, I can also talk to you offline after the meeting to clarify.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's what I was going to say anyway, Bob. So thank you.
Okay, let's move on to the second question, special events. And we've heard quite a lot about that. There's a lot in the management plan about special events, and I really appreciate the detail the detailed study that's been done on this. And we've seen a number of diagrams that show how the public access can be maintained, which is one of our primary concerns. How do people feel about that you know, the proposed size, you know, up to 4,000 people, some of the other aspects that are now proposed. Kristen.
I thought that was really helpful, the information that you provided on the events, particularly the diagram of how you could, you know, where the kind of edges of the events would be, the perimeter and the activation, and then where the public spaces would be and where the public parking would be. And I think particularly the things that I thought were successful were, you know, keeping bathrooms open to park visitors and requiring larger events to have their own facilities. And then making sure that you do have the kind of the walkways and the roads to the end of the park available, out to the mall, the beach, and the access to the beach continuously available. I thought that was important. And then some of those parking spaces for visitors. I think those key things are probably really important to maintain public access during those events. I also just wanted to share something that I learned. I was working with Spur on a policy paper for the COVID programs, the shared spaces programs for parklets. And one of the biggest obstacles that anybody had was the permitting was just incredibly complex for parklets before COVID. But there was a shift during COVID to default to yes and just helping people make it happen. And the permits became so much more simpler. It was like 4 questions you had to answer online to get the permit. And I would just recommend that, you know, to use that kind of an approach with especially smaller events like barbecues and things like that. Make it very easy for people to get those permits in very like low cost. So that, because I think the priority is really to activate the park, and especially for those smaller events, not that they're necessarily major revenue generators, that actually the benefit that's being derived from barbecues and family events and things like that is just the activation of the park itself. Yeah, those were my 2 thoughts.
It's a great comment. And, you know, when you look at what's happened during COVID and post-COVID to get people back into places, you know, Kristen, you could even imagine incentivizing, putting out communications where there might be a significant discount on events, or even barbecues are free for the next 2 months, and get people down there starting to use the barbecues and then gradually reintroduce, or those sorts of incentives could be very helpful. Okay, Stefan.
Thanks, Jacinta. I think the only question I have is, and I think for all of you, is just with regards to the programming the large events, sort of how everybody feels about extending the event area all the way to the water on the wharf side of the park, and if it sort of is worth considering an option where, particularly once the beach goes in, that there would be the opportunity to retain public access along the water side that could happen simultaneously with public events. And I think the other concepts and the scenarios that were described super helpful. I will say, that just comes up for me as that there is a very natural navigation that one can do along the water's edge in this location. And I think the beach will actually enhance that. The wharf is actually pretty generous. And so I'm just curious if there was a way that you could maintain a public easement across the wharf and still sort of get what you need to get out of public events. It would love to, if there's anyone else who has some comments or thoughts on that.
Kristen, go ahead.
I just wanted to respond specifically to that. I think there is a sort of a cool factor for events to be able to be, the events at the waterfront to be able to be near the waterfront. And, I don't know if it's this park has to compete with all the other parks to get events, and it's challenged in terms of location and accessibility and shuttle drop off for parking. So I think I would balance the benefits to the events of having some form of water access while still enabling sort of water frontage, while still enabling people to circulate between the other areas of waterfront access, particularly the beach and the kayak launch and all of that. So I personally think it might be a benefit to the park to be able to sort of market that, proximity to the water and still be able to maintain waterfront access in other places for park visitors.
Can I address that same?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, I just agree with Kristen, because I think just thinking about the quality of the experience with fencing for an event, splitting the wharf with like a tall fence to keep people, to control the event, just doesn't seem like a very nice experience for either side. Like it sort of diminishes the public access because it's split with a big fence, but then also it diminishes the possibility for the event to experience the water, because we want everybody to be able to experience the water as well, even though they're coming for a big event. I think that's a nice way to be able to experience the bay when they're at the event. So I would agree with Kristen that I think there's a lot of public access still when there's an event, And I think that having the event actually have a little bit of it is kind of a nice compromise.
Good point. Gary.
Yeah, just briefly, I was not really clear on whether the benefit from the events, is really worth the trouble, or the, repair and maintenance that's required from dealing with, large numbers of people. So that's kind of a question. Maybe I missed that, but I thought what David was presenting is that it's not really a significant revenue generator to take on the additional care that's required. And I was just thinking about what Kristen said about just making it super hospitable to families and small parties. If you had, a successful landscape and it was just a beautiful place to go and you had access to the water, that people would come, and that the services for, food trucks and so on would, when the people are there, I think other things tend to appear also, and that it could become more of a, low-key, self-sustaining kind of social ecology down there without having a lot of management and maintenance and repair. So anyway, just a thought. Yeah.
Yeah, no, Gary, it's a good point. And I think when David was presenting it, or it might be written in the plan as well, but I think the point in those pros and cons diagrams, I think, the point was made that it's a form of marketing the park. It's a form of, increasing the identity of the park to the community. If you get, a large number of people down there, maybe they'll come back again. It's, just because it's a little challenging to get there. So if you've got there once, maybe you'll come back again. But, I think it raises a question too about the timeline. Often management plans have a 5-year review period. And it seems to me that events are something that need to be reviewed periodically. If the frequency of large events exceeds whatever the defined number should be, then I would encourage a review of this every 5 years to see whether there should be a change in course. Because Gary, you're making a great point as well. If the level of usage of the park increases sufficiently without the need for the 8 to 10% of revenues that come from events, maybe that's great, but it's so far off that at the moment that I think it's reasonable to have events in the management plan at this time.
Right.
Tom?
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing. Couldn't there be a pilot program where you check it out, see how it works for a couple of years? What are the trade-offs in terms of, and I think that it's not really about the money as much as the outreach that it could provide. And I think after a year or two, certainly by 5, you're gonna know if that's working or not, whether it's worth continuing. But I would err on the side of more outreach than less, I guess.
Right. Okay, good. Let's move on to the planting. This was the third question we were asked to look at: planting strategy, palette, and maintenance. We had some clarifying questions that address this, but let's just have a dialogue here amongst the board. Just your thoughts on what we've been presented with. Gary.
Tom, you want to go first? You had your hand up.
Tom? I wasn't sure if your hand was still up, Tom, from the last question.
I was here first. No, I just have one thing, and it's about trees. I feel that groves of trees work better than 2 trees or 3 trees or 1 tree. And it's just like, the buffalo that's getting out of the herd, that's the one that gets nailed. And I think it's the same thing in these really severe coastal environments with heavy wind and sun, that the more they can kind of you can gang them together in groves of 7 or 10 or 15, they're going to survive better, and they're going to make more of a mark in terms of a place you can go, just because there's shade provided by those trees. And if there could be a little bit of topo to respond to them as well, it's nicer to kind of group them together and not leave them out on their own to be exposed so much. That's my experience being in places just like this, where I hike all the time. The trees survive better.
Yeah, Tom, I really agree with you on that. And I think there's also, if a tree doesn't survive, that there's not just a terrible gap in the tree planting, but if you look ahead for the next 20 years, the importance of shade for people in parks is just going to enhance. And you look at the photographs that the BCDC staff took in their recent visit, it's just so open and unshaded. So I think it's a great point you're making. Gary?
Yes. So I thought this is a fantastic plan, and WRA is obviously a very crucial player in this, deciding, helping to decide what is likely to be successful in these conditions. But I also think that being part of the installation and the maintenance, having all of that under one umbrella is really important. So maybe that's already the plan that you've decided on. I hope that's true. I think it's crucial to the success. And I was just wondering if for the final remarks, maybe WRA has a few words to say about the particular challenges of this site, because I think you have, these are proven winning strategies for the Marin Headlands type area in Crissy Field, where you have a lot of summer fog, where it's especially cool when it's very dry. And so here you have, a little less fog, you have this terribly sandy soil, and then you have the very high salinity, and then this super drought we're going through. You just comment on how you think you might be able to overcome that. That's all. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Gary. Any other comments on the planting strategy, maintenance?
Yeah, I had one.
Yeah, go ahead, Bob.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I think I work more on the restoration side and natural infrastructure side than perhaps some of the people that have worked on the plan, maybe with the exception of WRA. But what I've seen is that getting native plants to establish in dunes, for example, is really not that hard. And it actually is very cost competitive with other attempts or other types of vegetation in a coastal, sandy, salty environment with wind and sand moving around. And it also has other benefits. Ecology. I think people do like to walk around the beach with dunes and see the birds, etc. So it's perhaps a little different than a big party, although there are parties on the beach and bonfires and mini beaches. But what I found is that usually once you get it going and it looks pretty nice, your problem is too many people, not enough. Also, I think anyway, it can be less expensive and more sustainable. It does take perhaps some attention, and what I've seen, because a lot of our restoration projects don't have a lot of money, much funding, that there are groups that get involved that live in the community or just have an affinity for the park. The Pacific Estate Beach at Lindemar, for those of you who go to the coast, might recognize that dune field to the north is all managed by locals for decades now. The Surfers Point Park, which is on that dune network, I was involved in the design, and the Surfrider Foundation members maintain that, the weeding and the like, which is volunteer nonprofit. So I think that there's a possibility to get people engaged. It's actually quite nice to have a large area that you help maintain and enjoy.
Thanks, Bob.
Another form of outreach and engagement.
Yeah. And look, just right on that point, in relation to question 3, I think the we saw a presentation slides that address baseline plus the the next levels of implementation of improvements, and the planting will be staged over some years, I imagine. The details are probably there, but I think it would be the the conversion of this to the palettes that are proposed and the way in which the community can actually appreciate what's being done is a really important educational aspect of the park and its progressive enhancement over a period of 3 or 4 years, because it will be disrupted. And I think from the standpoint of one of our prime objectives, maintaining access, I just think that making the most of the opportunities to explain why things are being done and to get the community in there to appreciate that, but also making sure that access and staging are still maintaining the core functions of the park is going to be important. And it would be good, I think, for BCDC to make sure that there is a very clear delineation of exactly what's going to happen when across the timeline of those, the next 3 to 4 years. Okay, look, the final question we were asked to consider was the proposed beach design in consideration of its function to park users and rising sea level. And we had a lot of detail on it in the last presentation. We didn't receive a whole lot of detail in terms of the presentation tonight because I think we received it last time. But are there, and Bob, you've already made a couple of good points. Why don't you lead off with anything else that you want us to discuss here in the forum?
Thank you, Chair McCann. I really appreciate that. So just again, for the record, the last meeting, we saw a beach over to the side, to the north, I believe it is, abutting a steep area with, I think, some sort of concrete steps and a pier and et cetera. And we were not provided any background information on that at all, zero. And however, in the information that we received for this meeting, we received quite a bit. It all seems to go back to a charrette with a few folks, and that was very helpful to see that. I really appreciated the geotechnical information, which allayed some concerns I had about slope stability and settlement. There was a reference to the fine merit sands, which were the sands dredged in place, that they are fine. And because they're fine, they're very mobile. And that, I think, is a source of one of the problems. And then the designers did look at coarser sands, in particular sand that can be sourced from the Central Bay mining areas, which is coarser. But then there was some, I'm not sure I fully agree, some statements that the coarser sands aren't as ecologically valuable. And I think that kind of depends on the grain size and stuff. I mean, the Crissy Field sands are coarser than the Merritt sands, and they are ecologically valuable sands for invertebrates and other birds, etc. They're still somewhat mobile in the sand, in the wind. But anyway, I just want to kind of correct the trajectory. And so now that I've reviewed the materials, I would like to see an alternative plan from the ones that we've seen for the beach. I would like to see the beach expanded in the Middle Harbor Shoreline Park area, at least on the north side of that park, which this plan kind of does. But I think you should look at flattening the beach below mean lower low water. One of the concerns that I have heard, and I understand it as a beachgoer, is that once you get down to low tide or the wading depth at mid tide, you kind of drop off into this mud. And I think that's something that people don't like. And that is not really typical, despite what's in the SHRED documents, et cetera, for Bay Area beaches. Bay Area beaches do transition to more muddy areas at low water or in that zone, mean lower low water zone. But typically it's to a mud flat that's a little more stable, a little denser, and it's probably got some sands on it. So it may not feel as great on your toes, but you don't feel like you're going to drop off into deep water. So, and it's not mushy, so you don't feel like you're necessarily going to get your feet stuck or sink. So I would like to see an alternative that has the beach extended landward as well as waterward. I mentioned this in the last meeting, but I don't know that it was clear. I'm pretty sure it was in the minutes, but I didn't see anybody address it this time. I would like that addressed. It's okay, you didn't catch it the first time, but the idea is not to push the beach out into the water, which seems to be a bit of a concern for folks. I think you could try to do that, but also think about the beach as part of the park and don't push the beach out, but allow it to extend in where we already have some firm soils, and you already have a lot of problems with everything else that's been attempted at this park in terms of grass with geese and windblown sand. So I think flattening the beach, extending it upland will allow you to extend it down lower than low water. So think about that. I'd be happy to meet with staff and talk to people about it if that's appropriate. The other reason for extending the beach higher and inland, it's a little counterintuitive perhaps, but it's to provide accommodation space for sea level rise. So as sea level rises, to the extent there are some waves, it'll tend to move the sand up and in. There's not a lot of wave action, I don't think, in this area because it's all kind of, enclosed by breakwaters and the like. But I do think if you extended the slope in, then you can imagine that with a couple of feet of sea level rise at your, 1 on 20, 1 on 50 slope or whatever, you can anticipate how much space it would take. And I don't think it's that much considering how much land there is, but I think it would allow a migration or what we call transgression of the habitat. And you could work with that in terms of adding dunes close to the beach initially, maybe providing space for dunes or just setting the dunes back and having an open beach. The coarser sands that were discussed, I really have a fair amount of experience with that. And the coarser sands do knock down the wind transport quite a bit, and the Merritt sands are very fine and they move a lot. You don't have to go super coarse though. And again, Crissy Field's like 0.2, 0.3 millimeters. Anything coarser than that's not really going to move that much, I don't think. And so you don't have to go up to 0.5 or, into pebbles or anything weird. So those are my comments. To summarize, I would like to see an alternative that includes a beach in the shoreline park, which I think is what we were supposed to get. And I'd like to see it analyzed with all your other opportunities and constraints so that we know whether or not you think it's feasible. But I would like it considered, and I would like to see it extend landward and think of it as part of the park, not something that you push off into the bay and leave a narrow space for people to not feel comfortable. That's
Thanks,
my
Bob.
comment.
Okay, thanks, Bob. Does anyone else want to weigh in on that? All good? Okay, well, look, with that, I think I'll just make a high-level summary before we head back. I think just to really encapsulate, how important this work is, I think all of us share a real passion for this park based on its regional significance. And it was great to hear the Port approaching this work so seriously and with the level of engagement from the staff there and leadership with both the planning and the management plan to date. As far as the organizational structure options go for the management plan, I think that we've all got strong support for the fact that those options are being investigated. We're certainly interested in seeing how the ongoing process evolves with those three options, and are very serious about not assuming that the default is going to always go back to the Port, that, really need to push that process. And you heard a number of considerations for how inputs to the financial analysis, particularly in respect to making sure that there's adequate funding on an annual basis for management, maintenance, etc. Special events, I think general support for special events, and I think general support from our group too, about from the board too, on the sizes that were represented and the locations that were represented in the diagrams today. But with making sure that electrical power outlets, appropriate provisions are there to ensure that these events can happen smoothly. And that part of the reason for special events, I mean, a big part is to promote the park, and that, you know, over time, you know, whether it's a couple of years, 2 to 5 years, you know, this should be regularly reviewed to make sure that we're not losing our prime interest in public access and prime interest in enhancing the views to the bay and accomplishing the balance that we need to see in a park of this nature. The planning strategy, palette and maintenance, I think we had some great comments there, and it's I do appreciate the expertise within the board on this topic, and I really appreciate the hard work that's been done by Linda and the team, WRA and others. And I think there was a request that perhaps WRA could make a couple comments in the final close. And then on the proposed beach design, a comment from Bob to investigate an option which would extend the beach further inward and with a series of environmental benefits that would flow from that. And bearing in mind that the work is going to be done by another agency. Okay, so with that, we will now move to the project proponent response for a brief response, as that concludes our comments and recommendations. Would someone like from the team, Aaron, would you like to lead off, please?
Yeah, I'd be happy to take the lead in responding, but I want to acknowledge all the work from my colleagues internally at the port, and Jan Novak has been working on this prior to my existence at the port. So I'd like to give him just a slight opportunity to correct any of my statements or provide additional input that may be helpful to the board. I first want to say I was married in Oakland. I had 2 kids here in the last 5 years. I live in the Fruitvale. My wife teaches in Chinatown, and I care a lot about Oakland. And I got, just since we used to work together at AECOM in the sustainable economics, Bob actually gave me the start to my career. Don't want to promote a bias, but he was willing at ESA to hire me on as an economist to look at the economic benefits of restoration. So I just realized the more older I get, how small the world is, and I'm very appreciative for those connections. So I felt incredibly privileged to be assigned to be the maritime lead to this project, as someone who has young kids who I value more than anything, that they have exposure to diversity, the environment, considerations that I didn't grow up with growing up in Fresno, California, in a very suburban neighborhood. And so it's, as my kids are screaming upstairs as they're trying to go to bed, I'm like, I'm pretty happy where I'm at right now, and that I'm talking to all of you. I want to just, I guess, before I respond to anything that was said, I just want to commend the just incredible work of our consultants, Gates and Associates, BAE, WRA. They've been the experts we've needed. They've provided us just honest, thoughtful input that has caused me to be curious in certain ways and to expect about this park. And so a lot of the presentation is due to their work. And I'm just glad to be able to have the luxury to work with people who are as just experts in their roles as we've had the privilege to do. I just want to respond that the feedback from the DRB has been meaningful to us, at least for me as an individual, and I would expand that to my team at the port. It's been thoughtful. It's been borrowed from your own time. You could be doing other things right now. You're not getting paid for this, or maybe a small stipend, I don't know. But we really care about making this a space that is at the forefront for the public good, rather than for the financial good of the port. And I think all the input that we've received to date has been guiding us on that path to like, how do we reimagine what this space can be? How do we thoughtfully think about how to repurpose our finances to achieve that end goal? So that's just my macro comments. And I just want to tick through a few things. And more than anything, I want to say, like, the port is more than happy to provide in detailed comment via writing if our responses leave you with more questions than you had originally. We want to be responsive to your input, and likely I'm a human being with finite abilities, so I probably won't be as responsive as I need to be to everything that was said tonight. I wanted to just check through this real quick, and I just took some quick notes, and you'll see me looking at my other screen right now, so you won't see my eyes. But I really appreciated from Kristen talking about the importance of input on the management plan before making improvements. That is exactly why we've structured these improvements in baseline. What are we committed to? And then levels 1 and 2, which are kind of like to more activate the park and think about maybe diversifying uses. We've also gotten a lot of pushback from community groups in Oakland about the park can't be everything for everyone. What are you going to do? And that's a difficult dance to navigate. But I think there is, well, I will commit from the port that we acknowledge what we know and what we don't know, and we're likely better operating the seaport than operating the regional park. And so we want to win on the expertise of the people who are expert at that in our communities, whether it be City of Oakland, East Bay Regional Parks, the whole planting, design, very high level concepts came because Richard Sinkoff, our Director of Environmental Programming, he knows the lead of the Presidio Trust. And so we literally had him out here, and he was saying to us, we had to import the sands that you have here. And so like we've gotten some really just healthy and reliable input from people who know what they're doing, people who are running a large operation that impacts a lot of lives. So I completely agree, and the port will take the stance of, like, let's talk to experts and trust the experts of what should be done in what order. And I just want to commit to that as we've kind of gone through this night. Additionally to Kristen's input on electrical infrastructure, I just wanted to add, I'm exploring we are our own utilities at the port. I'm exploring putting solar arrays across all the kind of enhancements over the picnicking structure with supporting battery electrical systems. So I think there's some like very positive opportunities which we receive grant funding for, and we can choose where we deliver those funds. So I think there's some promising opportunities at Middle Harbor Shoreline Port for developing some form of electrical infrastructure that will mitigate the impact of events, and will also provide more sustainable and clean energy for our community. Bob, you talked about beach funding, and I appreciate that. I wish I could be at the beach every day, and I'm stuck in the Fruitvale at the fort and I'm not seeing it. But with respect to beach funding, anything above the mean high water line, that's on the port. And the Army Corps is leading things that are not within that zone of influence. And those are dependent on appropriations of different sorts, but like would be happy to get you any information I can to transparently just, illuminate what the funding program is and how that works. Gary, you discussed, money that could go down the drain from, a management plan that doesn't include third-party input. And I completely agree. And the port agrees with that. And that's why we are engaging first the City of Oakland and concurrently engaging East Bay Regional Parks District. We think their input is critical. We have no intention to invest in something that can't be sustainably managed And I just want to give you the port's commitment on that end, and would happy to include you in any conversations or meetings around those type of issues. Stefan, apologies, I'm new to this. How can we use Middle Harbor Shoreline Park as a learning lab? How can we share the experience learned through investment and success and or failure, or partial success or partial failure? I think that's critical. I mean, I think we speak a lot about climate adaptation, and you know, the last part of climate adaptation is adaptive management. And considering what inputs are needed to adaptively manage is critical. And so I was very excited when you made those points about, like, not just leaving this in the management plan. I think it actually, David had a slide to this in his presentation, like there's a management plan and a management agreement. And I would think operationally, we probably formalize an adaptive evaluation process through a management agreement. So it's institutionalized. And the port would welcome your input or anyone's input on how to do that in a way that is positive to the park, positive to the region, and positive to California as a whole, as someone who's leading these experiments. Jacinta, you made a really good point, which got me thinking tonight about iterations of the management and master plan and repair versus replace. You know, if we develop a management agreement that is based on existing conditions, we're probably going to fall short. And we're going to fall short because the aspirations of this management plan and this master plan is that we activate more use. So functionally, these facilities that we manage are going to be under differing levels of use than what we've had historically. And so I would welcome the opportunity to figure out what the right linguistics is, or statements of commitment to acknowledge this existing conditions regime to a future conditions regime that is not just like focused on managing the natural environment, but the built environment and the populations that we hope to flow from those investments. Kristen, you had a comment about water frontage. That is a complicated matter. I don't know how to deal with that in a streamlined way, but I think that's a real issue. Like, how do you encourage more use of this space through special events while also not trivializing the experience that other people who don't know about that experience that show up? And how do you do that in an economical way? I'm trained as an economist, so I often think through the economics of things. So I think that's a really important issue, and I'm really glad you identified that. And I would love to figure out how to operationalize how we, maybe don't get it right the first time, but how we evaluate it and get it right over time. So I really appreciate that comment. Gary made a comment about the benefits of events and people to the revenue structure. And I think that is a critically important component, and they're not dualistic. They're not, there's not negative and positive electrons here. I think figuring out how to host special events and activate the park and also generate revenues for the park is a complicated consideration. And I think we need to put thought behind that, and we need to define what we think is valuable as a trade-off. Is it financial revenue to reinvest in the park? Is it activating more communities who would maybe not ever know this park exists? And so I really appreciated that that comment.
Hey, Aaron, I'm just going to jump in here. This is excellent.
Okay, sorry.
Could you maybe wrap up in a couple of minutes? That'd be
I'll wrap up in 2 minutes. I'm looking at the clock. I'm a man of my word. Gary, you talked about trees. We have been in conversation with CAL FIRE, and we are looking to work with the Oakland Parks Foundation among their subsidiaries to not wait till this master plan or management plan is finalized and implemented. We're looking for opportunities to leverage CAL FIRE funding to invest in tree planting, which would activate community engagement, because that's a big part of their model. They pay the trees and we get the community involved. And so that's a very active conversation. It started about 3 weeks ago, and I'm really excited about. And I think it's a great opportunity to just, illuminate the benefits of CAL FIRE's funding, illuminate how communities can be involved, and how it can also solve issues with a place like the port that's more concrete than trees. So I've said a lot of things tonight, and I'm not the only one who speaks on behalf of the port, but I am just so proud to work with my port team, BCDC staff, Catherine jumping in, at the last minute, Ashley supporting us administratively, Andrea calling in from, I don't know where she's at. This is a group effort, and I would just really, as my kids were crying upstairs tonight and making noise, I felt very confirmed that this effort we're putting in has been recognized tonight. And I think the commitment from the port is like, we want to continue to be good partners in this process, not to meet a permit requirement, but to really advance the possibility of this space. And so that's a really long diatribe, but I thank you for giving me the time, Jacinta, and thank you for giving my team and our consultants the time to just be demonstrative of the time and effort they put in. And I'd be happy, me and Jan and Ramona are kind of leading this effort. We'd be happy to respond to anything offline that you have questions to.
Thank you, Aaron, and thank you for that response on behalf of the port. We're running short on time here. I know there was a question from Gary. It was a specific question. He wondered whether WRA could respond on the point of whether the climate that's experienced in this part of the bay compared to some of the other parts of the bay would be, just how that might impact planting. Gary, I haven't rephrased what you said very clearly there. I don't know whether we've got time to hear from WRA tonight, but we could maybe just have that feedback brought in, or if WRA can make a very brief comment on that, that would be fine too. Is there a representative from WRA with us tonight? Russell? Yes.
Yes, I'm here. I'm happy to speak briefly.
Yes, great. Thanks, Russell.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and everybody's brought up a lot of good comments regarding, the challenges of restoring these type of plant communities, especially at that site. So we certainly acknowledge that it's difficult and that it's a process. And we've tried to identify plants within those communities that are adaptable to these conditions and not necessarily the same type of plants you might see somewhere else, that doesn't have the wind and sun exposure and sandy soils. So we've tried to kind of distill down that plant palette. I think back dunes kind of work as a good example of a palette, to go with. Those are sort of backbone species that can work in shallow soils, low water, the sandy soils, and then expand from those, looking at species that might occur in more southern, hotter part of the state. So yeah, we're looking at all those things and everything everybody else has said about it being a process and needing, various site prep before you even install, testing different installation methods, having maintenance, adaptive management, everything. We're looking forward to kind of developing those things because it is a unique opportunity with a pretty big area to restore some of these native communities that you just don't see much of around the bay.
Well, thank you, Russell, and thank you for your excellent work and the teamwork with Linda and Linda Gates and BAE. I just want to echo how much we appreciate the hard work of the team.
Sure, my pleasure.
Jan, did you want to just say anything briefly to wrap up, or has it all been said?
I think it's been said, but I just wanted to thank the team again, the design review board for your comments. As you can see by the changes we've made to our presentation and to our overall plans, we take your comments very seriously, and that it's good feedback. And also thank you to BCDC staff for organizing everything, and wish everybody a good rest of your Monday night, and thank you again for taking the time.
Okay, thank you, Jan. Thank you to all the team. I know there are a number of people on the call who did not speak, but we really appreciate you joining us for this review. Andrea, hello. It's great to see you come on from your lovely place. Andrea, so before we adjourn the meeting, there's an important question. Do we want to see this project again as this process continues to move forward? Just board sentiment on this. If you can raise your hand if you'd like to see it again, if there's an opportunity. Andrea?
Yeah, I'd like to see it again. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, Andrea, you're on mute.
Oh. Sorry.
Can't hear you.
Go ahead.
Sorry. Go ahead, Andrea.
I was muted in 2 spots. You are going to be talking to these folks next month about the 7th Street connector. So I think if there's sort of any lingering questions that they can provide additional clarification for, we can work on incorporating those into a briefing either next month or at a later time. I do also want to mention that the settlement agreement has timelines for the permit amendment that have an extension trigger for every time there's an additional design review board meeting. So the DRB effectively extends the process upon which we would implement the agreements for the permit amendment and have that process. It doesn't necessarily have to, but it provides an allowance for it. And so, you know, I don't know how that shapes your decision, but we can work through that either way.
Andrea, just a clarifying question then. If we do not request a follow-on formal review of this project, can you just, or just to clarify, you and the staff will be keeping close track with the way the project continues forward, correct? How does that relationship continue?
Yeah, so basically the feedback and discussion that occurred tonight will be continued at a staff level, and we will continue to work on resolutions and address the comments and issues with the port.
Right. So I'm hearing from you that, you know, every time if we just keep asking to review the project and keep close to the process, we're going to delay the process of permitting, basically, right?
In some ways, but if it's necessary, then it's necessary.
I understand.
Could I also just, sorry I know it's not my place to interject, but Bob, I believe that there is a lot of confusion about the beach, and if you would be willing to meet with Erin and myself offline, I think we could clear up a lot of the issues around the beach and let you know like what parameters, what we can actually address and what we cannot address through the Middle Harbor Shoreline Park.
Were you speaking to me? I think you said Bob.
I said Bob, yes.
Yeah, okay, thank you. You know, it's up to BCDC. You know, way these boards meetings work, they're public meetings, and I have to be careful about not having any kind of, you know, a potential conflict of interest or whatever, which I as far as I know, I don't have. But it would be up to the staff. I'd be happy to do that, but I'm not sure what the parameters are of that kind of situation. And just so we're super clear, in my view, the beach is part of the park. The Corps builds it fine, but I haven't seen it. at a level that I feel comfortable with it. I think you're close. It's not my fault I haven't seen it at a level I'm comfortable with it. So I want to see it again. That's my bottom line. I'm not trying to be difficult, but that's my role as a board member. That's my opinion.
Could we, since we're seeing the connector next month, could we have a follow-up just specifically on the beach for a few minutes, just to, you know, or whatever time it takes? Andrea, is that a possibility?
Yeah, and we can work with the port staff to come up with a solution that's agreeable to everyone.
Yeah. Okay.
Because I understand Bob's perspective.
Yeah.
Yeah, just so you guys know, the Corps of Engineers placed over 300,000 cubic yards of sand out at Ocean Beach last fall, and they pushed it up on the beach with bulldozers. So don't think of the mean high water line as a boundary. I know a lot of people think it is, but nature doesn't look at it that way. So you got to figure it out. It's not that hard. Got to figure it out.
Okay, so look, I think what we're deciding here is that we're not going to ask for a follow-on formal review of the project. But Andrea, we would like to see you figure out with the port how we can arrange a review of the beach again, whether that's, you know, just as a separate thing, not to review all of the good work that's been done. I think we've made our points tonight. Okay, does that sound all right?
Yes, as long as we're seeing it again. And I'm happy to meet with people. I need some advice from the BCDC staff.
Gary?
One, if they want that, and two, if it's okay. So
Yeah, we'll leave it with Andrea. Gary, did you need to say
Yeah, I was
something?
just gonna say, as others mentioned, I mean, there's so much we all can learn from following this process. That's partly why I want to see it. But is there a way for us to get briefings as it develops that would not delay the project?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think there's a difference. You know, I agree with you, Gary. I think we all feel passionate about this park, and there is a difference between receiving an update briefing versus a formal review. So, Andrea, we'll leave that in you and your team's capable hands to figure all of that out. How does that sound?
Okay. It looks like Kristen has something.
Kristen?
I just wanted to say, I think the port has done such an exemplary job of showing that they've really taken our feedback seriously and responded to it. I feel very comfortable with you guys moving forward, working with staff. I think it's been a really wonderful process, and you should be able to have some benefit from that. So that would be my vote.
Thanks, Kristen. Okay, so look, with that, I think we'll move to adjourn. It concludes our project review for the meeting. Thank you to everyone for participating. And I'd like to entertain a motion and a second to adjourn our meeting. Gary's proposing.
Yes.
Second, please.
I make a second.
Thanks, Andrew. And with that, could we have a vote on that? Any objections?
No.
Hearing none. Hearing none. The meeting's adjourned. Thank you to everyone. Good night. Thanks for your great comments tonight. And Andrew, we wish you well. We'll miss you. Okay. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everyone.